Alright, y'all, so we're going to finish up the Civil War today. We just got a few more slides. Yesterday, I heard some of y'all talk, and y'all felt I went a little bit too fast yesterday. I agree, I did go a little bit too fast. There was just a lot of content to cover. But today we have a little bit less, so I might be able to spend a little bit more time and just not rush through it as much. So let's dive in and look at this. Where we left off, the South just got defeated at Gettysburg, and the North started to take the advantage of the conflict. Because of the Northern Army's success, Lincoln is elected again, and he states in his second inaugural address a change in his philosophy. He still had three main beliefs: equality of the Union and government, but he stated that slavery perpetrated the war. Basically, that the war is all about slavery, and the Southern need for slavery is the reason why the war started. And he's denouncing slavery because of its awfulness. Again, he continued to believe that the Union, we should fight for the restoration of peace. We should not create separate nations. And Lincoln said that there were people, not only before this time, but people that were trying to destroy the government all the way since its creation. You can't have states having too much power. You have to have a strong federal government. What's interesting in this picture here, I wanted to show someone that's going to come up again. Here's Abraham Lincoln giving a speech, right? And there's a guy right beside him, right up here. His name is John Wilkes Booth. And this is going to be really influential down the road. Alright guys, question time. So I'm going to have the teacher pause the video and discuss the question with you. Okay guys, I'm back. So remember this guy right here? The guy that was so close to Lincoln back before, the South lost the war? Well, he's going to end up shooting Lincoln. And Lincoln is assassinated almost immediately after the Civil War is over. And Lincoln is shot by John Wilkes Booth, who's a Southern sympathizer. He lived in the North and he was raised in the North, but he sympathized with the Southern people. And President Lincoln's assassination caused a lot of ripples and hardships in the North. Lincoln was a strong and charismatic leader, and he kept the North bound together for this fight that a lot of Northerners were upset about. But with Lincoln's assassination, people were concerned. His vice president was Johnson, and Johnson really was butting heads with a lot of the Republicans in office. Johnson was a moderate, where the Republicans who controlled the legislative were very radical. So because of this, there's a lot of butting heads going on after Lincoln's assassination. But what's interesting about this is, and this is a little bit off topic, you don't need to know it for the STAR test, but I think it's interesting. I like to tell you the interesting stuff, history. The plot was much larger. During this time, there was five major people who, if Lincoln would have died, there was a succession that if Lincoln died and the vice president died, then it would go to the Secretary of State. If the Secretary of State died, then it will look at the Secretary of the Interior and Secretary of War. But there was a plan. Booth actually organized 5 assassins to attack the vice president, the president, Secretary of State, Secretary of Interior, and some of the major state officials all at once. Now, luckily for the North, this plot failed. Now, Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth, and the Secretary of State was beaten almost nearly to death by one of the assassins. But the assassin who tried to assassinate the vice president got cold feet and actually got drunk and couldn't kill anyone. And the other 2 assassins just ran out of town. They were just too terrified. So the assassination plot failed, but it could have been disastrous for the North and could have continued the Civil War if all 5 of these people would have been killed. And that really shows you that this idea about assassination really wasn't thought of deeply at this point. The secession will develop later on. All right, so another question time. I'm gonna have the teacher pause the video and discuss these with you. All right, so after, or almost coinciding, just a little bit after, Lee finally surrenders. Now, the South, it was obvious, was losing all the way up to this point. It was only made official by Lee's surrender. And basically, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee and Grant sit down and they finally decide to end the war. And the priority shifts to bring the South back to the Union. The South's already been defeated. Now, how do we get these southern states brought back to the Union, and how do we rebuild the nation? And this looks at some geographic roles of the Civil War. Geography played a huge factor. Now, the North was able to win for several major reasons. One of the most important one is railroads. Now, railroads was huge during this conflict because most of the fighting was done here in the South, right? Look at all these battles in Tennessee, in Kentucky, in North Carolina, in Virginia, in Mississippi. All these battles being fought. Now, the northern industry is way up here in New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois. So, getting goods from up here in the north to the south is extremely difficult. But because the north had so many lines of railroads, that they were able to easily transport their goods down to the south and supply their armies. Their armies were better equipped, better supplied, so they got more victories. Now, the south was a little had some geographic favors or roles as well. Basically, the South's capital was in Richmond, which was pretty well protected. The North's capital, on the other hand, was right there, right by Virginia. So even though Virginia had a better defended capital and the North had a worse defended capital, because is right here. That's like if we went to war with, I don't know, if we went to war with Canada, and we at the time changed our city's capital to Detroit, which is right on the border with Canada. Or if we go to war with Mexico and change our capital down to Brownsville or change it to El Paso. That'll put us in a bad position because our capital is really close to what would be considered the enemy at the time. Not only that, but the South had really great ports. If you look here in the South, there's a lot of these little inlet rivers that make good little protected harbors. Now, the North couldn't have the South taking over or transporting all these different goods overseas to get weapons, so they came up with what's called the Anaconda Plan. All of these ships around the South that destroyed any naval ship trying to enter or leave the Southern territories. And it was a way to keep all goods away from the South. And the Port of New Orleans sitting right here. The Port of New Orleans was very strategic for the North because it would cut off supplies. If you take over New Orleans and you take over the Mississippi River, you win the war because you split off the breadbasket of the South, which gets most of its food, Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, from the rest of the South. That was the main textile industries, and that equaled huge victories. All right, guys, another question time. Teacher's going to pause the video and go over this question with you. All right, I'm back. So Medal of Honor recipients. There's tons of these Medal of Honor recipients, but two of these I really want to bring up. William Carney is the first one, and he was a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient. What's interesting, he served in the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. This regiment fought in the North, and it was the first all African American volunteer regiment. Now, what's interesting about this is they were kind of kept away from fighting at first because they didn't think they could fight as well. Then, when they learned how good of fighters they were put into the worst situations because they were seen as expendable. But this dude right here, he was a sergeant, or when the 54th Regiment sergeant was shot down, this soldier dropped his weapon. Remember, he's being shot at right now, and he picked up his flag and led all the way to the fort they're being attacked. And he fought through all this fierce fire, being shot several times to carry along this flag to inspire his troops. And this scene of patriotism, of heroism, was rewarded with the Medal of Honor. Ooh, I'm sorry guys, there was a mistake on PowerPoint. I got it going again. So Philip Bizarre was born in Chile, South America, and he immigrated to the north, and he became a Navy seaman in the Union Navy. And he won the Medal of Honor for his distinguished service. Basically, what happened was that his naval ship was involved with the bombarding and invading of a Confederate fort. And he was trying to help coordinate this attack on the fort. So he went from his ship that was firing cannons into the fort onto the beach several times to give messages to the soldiers who invaded the fort and back to his ship. So think about this. There's bombs and bullets flying over your head nonstop. And this guy is running off the ship onto a little boat, going to the beach where people are firing on both sides, give messages, and go back to the ship. He did this several times. And his just complete rejection of fear of dying for his duty allowed him to win this Medal of Honor. All right, last slide, guys. Just a review during the Civil War. There's a lot of congressional presidential responses to issues of the Civil War. Now, I talked about the first one, the Missouri Compromise, the Dred Scott decision. These were congressional responses to the slavery issue. But what we're going to talk about in our next unit, Reconstruction, is it actually focused on slaves' rights as well. And the legislation responded by the failures of the Dred Scott versus Stanford decision, saying that you can't have any free states, with the 14th Amendment that granted citizenship to all African Americans. Now, the presidential response was a little bit different. During World War II, he created an idea. He took away the idea of due process, or the suspension of habeas corpus, which basically said that if you spoke against the government or you created any terrorist action against government, we could throw you in jail for an indefinite period of time. And some people were really worried about that, especially Congress. But what Congress did, after looking at the proceedings and seeing what went on in the war, they realized that their fear wasn't necessary. The Congress enacted the Habeas Corpus Suspension Act of 1863, which authorized suspension of habeas corpus and relieved the president from being held liable for actions without congressional approval. Congress actually found that his decision to suspend this law and to have almost a strong arm to make sure that the country's fighting as a whole was good for the nation. And this policy here, this idea that the president has almost complete power during warfare, will continue all the way throughout our history and will be especially important during World War II. Alright guys, so we finished our lesson. Now we're going to go to our mini lesson, which, independent practice, which you're all going to work on the graphic organizer on page 273. And on a sheet of paper, you will answer the sections titled Key Events of the Civil War. Now, as always, guys, if you have any questions, please ask Mr. Parkman to go back over some of the key PowerPoint slides. All right, so this will be the last mini lesson we're going to do this week. We're going to have our unit test next week. I know you probably are all groaning right now. You have a STAAR test. I understand we have to knock this out so that we can have a long time to prepare for your STAAR test in history, okay? But I promise you it's not going to be on the same day as your STAAR test for English. So I'm gonna give you a break, and then we're gonna go back and review this test. Okay? All right, guys. Good luck on your STAAR test. Y'all do great. You're gonna knock the English out of the park. Then we'll hit on the math, history, and science. Y'all gonna do awesome, guys. All right. See you tomorrow.